I was 14, just babysitting my little cousin for the night. It was around 9 p.m., and we were hanging out at his house, just watching TV while my mom and aunt were shopping, and my dad and uncle were at the movies. It felt like a normal night, until it didn't. I started feeling this weird sense of unease, like something was off. I tried to ignore it, but it just kept nagging at me. So I got up and walked over to the back door to make sure it was locked. When I was coming back through the kitchen, though, I froze. Right there in the window, I saw this man. He looked rough, like really rough. Homeless, dirty, like he hadn't slept in days. And he wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight at my cousin, who was still in the living room watching TV. I felt this rush of adrenaline, and I knew I had to stay calm and act like I hadn't seen him. I casually told my cousin, "Hey, let's go upstairs. It's getting late, and your parents wouldn't want you staying up too long." He didn't ask any questions, just followed me up, which was a relief. I put him to bed, told him everything was fine, and then went back downstairs, hoping the guy was gone. When I got to the kitchen, the window was empty. I let out a shaky breath and grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a meat tenderizer. I checked the front door, making sure both the deadbolt and the knob were locked, then went back upstairs to my cousin's room and sat in front of the door, clutching that meat tenderizer for dear life. My cousin woke up and asked what I was doing. I told him to keep his head down and stay quiet, which, thankfully, he did. I called the cops and then my dad and uncle. The cops said it would take them half an hour to get there, and my dad and uncle were about 45 minutes away. So it was just me, my cousin, and this awful silence in the house. Then I heard it, the sound of a window breaking downstairs, and heavy footsteps. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might give us away. I whispered to my cousin to stay under the covers and not make a sound. I could hear the guy moving around downstairs, his boots thudding with each step. He moved slowly, like he was looking for something, or someone. I sat there gripping the meat tenderizer, my hands shaking, listening to him go from room to room. First my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. I thought he was going to come into my cousin's room next, but instead, I heard him go back downstairs. Then there was silence. After what felt like forever, the cops finally showed up. They searched the house and found out that the guy had come from a mental hospital a province away and had somehow ended up here. He'd been wandering around, and we were just unlucky enough to be in his path. It was probably the scariest night of my life. So, I was living in this split-level duplex with my ex, 4 cats, and a foster black lab mix. The setup was pretty straightforward. The lower level had a family room that doubled as my office and exercise space, plus a bedroom and a laundry bathroom. But here's the thing. The cats never went downstairs. Not once. And the dog absolutely hated it down there. I figured maybe it was just the vibe of the place or something, but I'd always feel like I was being watched whenever I went down. I told myself it was just because the windows were at street level, being a daylight basement and all. But yeah, it always felt a little off. I had 2 weird experiences down there, and while only one happened when I was home alone, I'll tell you about both for context. The first time, I was doing laundry. My ex was upstairs, totally engrossed in his video game, so he was oblivious to anything else going on. I had my headphones in, trying to just get through it. But as I was loading the washer, I heard this snap. like someone snapping their fingers right next to my ear, like they were trying to get my attention. I ripped my headphones out and looked around, expecting to see, well, someone. But of course, I was completely alone. I brushed it off as my imagination, but that didn't make me feel any better about being down there. The second experience, though, that one's harder to explain. My ex had taken half our little zoo with him for the day to visit his family in Big City, so it was just me, 2 of the cats, and I was having a nice quiet day. I went downstairs to print some coupons. Back in the early 2000s, we still did that because no smartphones. Anyway, I'm printing, and suddenly I hear the front door. Like I actually heard the lock click open, the door swing, and then close. And then I heard footsteps on the landing. I immediately called out, "Hey, you're back early!" Because honestly, who else would it be? I walked to the bottom of the stairs, expecting to see my ex there with a very excited dog and 2 annoyed cats. But when I got to the landing, no one. The door was shut, there was no car in the driveway, and the street was empty. I checked the neighbor's place too, completely quiet. The cats were upstairs lounging around, not even remotely interested. I grabbed my phone and called my ex, and he was still in Big City, as confused and a little freaked out as I was. He ended up racing back home, and after that, he made sure to leave the dog with me anytime he went out. I've never had an auditory hallucination before or since. It was like something just wanted me to know it was there. So it was just me and my older sibling, home alone, in this tiny town in Ohio. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. My sibling had been grounded, and in true small-town parenting style, our parents had locked up both the house phone and my sibling's phone in my dad's gun safe. No idea what they did to get grounded, but it must have been something my parents thought was a huge deal. Our grandparents lived down the street, and our great-grandma had a little house built right next to them so she could stay independent, but still close to family. My parents said they were heading over to check on her, and then they'd be back, and we'd order pizza for dinner. I was about 7 at the time, and my sibling was around 14 or 15, so the pizza sounded like a pretty great plan. We hung out playing video games, waiting for them to come back, and after about 2 hours, I started getting hungry and wondering where they were. That's when we heard a knock on the door. I was excited, thinking they were back with food, so I headed downstairs with my sibling following me. But when I got to the door, I looked through the big window, and it wasn't my parents. It was this tall, skinny guy, probably mid-20s, with scruffy facial hair and dark hair. Here's the thing. In our small town, you knew everyone, and I'd never seen this guy before in my life. So I just kind of held up a finger like, "1 sec," and closed the curtain, hoping he'd take the hint. When I turned around, my sibling was staring at the door, looking as shocked as I felt. And then things got weird. The knocking turned into pounding. The handle started rattling, like he was trying to force his way in. We were both freaked out, with no way to call anyone. My sibling grabbed my hand, dragged me into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. But I remember it actually broke in their hand. So they grabbed another one, and we ended up hiding in the laundry room, holding on to each other as we listened to the pounding and banging that just kept getting louder. It felt like hours, but it was probably 5 minutes later that we heard the front door open. My heart was racing, and I could feel my sibling's grip tighten around the knife, ready to defend us. But then, instead of this strange guy, my mom turned the corner, holding 2 pizza boxes, looking totally confused to find us crumpled on the floor, both of us in tears. We jumped up and told her about the man at the door, and she just laughed. Turns out, My dad was outside chatting with the guy. Apparently, he was asking about some old car we had sitting in the driveway. My mom said he was a mechanic and thought it was for sale, even though it didn't have a for sale sign on it or anything. She apologized and gave us both big hugs, promising they wouldn't lock the phones up if they left again. We spent the rest of the night eating pizza, trying to calm down, though I remember barely tasting it between choked up sobs. My sibling and I talked about it a little, wondering why he'd acted that way. But as kids, we kind of just accepted our parents' explanation and let it go. Now, years later, as an adult, I can't shake the uneasy feeling whenever I think back to that night. I mean, who tries to get into a house like that? Pounding, shaking the door handle when no one answers, especially when it's a kid who gave a 1-second signal. And why would he be asking about a random car in the driveway so late, close to 9 or 10 at night? Looking back, it just doesn't add up. Adults don't act that way, especially not in small towns. My gut tells me we might have actually been in real danger that night. And honestly, I don't think I'd want to know what would have happened if my parents hadn't come home when they did. I must have been in 7th or 8th grade at the time. It was a weekend, cold and overcast, and I had the house to myself. My parents were out for the day, and my older brother, who was a lot older and worked all the time, wasn't home either. So it was just me, and I decided to settle in and get some homework done. I sat at the kitchen table, spread out my books, and started working. Our house was small and simple. To my left was the hallway, and down that hallway were all the bedrooms, the bathroom, and my room on the right, my parents' and my brother's rooms on the left. With the dreary light outside, the house felt dim and quiet, but peaceful. I was enjoying the calm, honestly. Then, in the middle of working, I heard it. Someone at the end of the hallway called my name. And it wasn't just any voice. It was a woman, and she used my childhood nickname, clear as day. I froze, heart pounding. My blood went cold. I glanced to my left, down the hallway, half expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I closed my books, grabbed my jacket, and got out of the house without looking back. I was already crying, too terrified to stay. I went out to our garage, climbed up on my dad's red lawnmower, and just sat there, watching the back door of the house like my life depended on it. I knew it was impossible for anyone else to be in the house. I'd been home all day, and no one else was around. But that voice was so real. I sat there, shivering and watching, for what felt like forever, until my parents finally came home. The second they pulled into the driveway, I ran over and told them what happened. They went inside and checked the place top to bottom, but of course there was nothing there. They chalked it up to my imagination and told me not to worry. Years later, I still live in that house, helping my mom now that she's older. My dad passed away a while back, and Mom's been here alone most of the time. What's strange, though, is that my mom hears voices too. She's told me she'll hear my dad calling her from the living room. She'll walk in, expecting him to need something, only to find no one there. She brushes it off as her imagination, but hearing her talk about it always makes me think back to that day and that voice calling my name from the hallway. Right after high school, around 19, I moved into my first apartment. I'd only been living there about a month when something happened that still freaks me out to this day. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, just watching TV, with the front door locked, both the top and bottom locks secured. Suddenly, I heard keys going into the door, and I actually saw the locks starting to turn. My heart dropped. I froze, not knowing what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone, had no maintenance scheduled, and I knew no one else should have a key. The door swung open, and there stood this older Asian man with bags of clothes and a few boxes. Right away, he started yelling at me in a language I didn't understand, and I could tell he was furious. Before I could react, he charged at me, started hitting me, and dragged me out of my own apartment. He had me in a chokehold, and I was struggling to break free when, thankfully, my upstairs neighbor heard the commotion, ran down, and managed to pull him off me. We called the police, and when everything finally got sorted out, the truth came out, and it was just as bizarre as it was terrifying. Apparently, there'd been a huge mix-up at the leasing office. They'd accidentally given this man the key to my apartment and told him it was his. He had bought a unit site unseen and was told it was empty. So when he walked in and saw me there, with just a TV, a chair, and an inflatable mattress, he assumed I was squatting. He thought I was some random person illegally staying in his apartment. Turns out, he was supposed to be moving into Unit 54, but I was in Unit 56, right next door. The leasing office just gave him the wrong key, and he didn't know any better. In the end, I pressed charges against him and sued the apartment complex for letting a stranger into my place, which ended in a full-blown attack. He didn't move in next door, and as part of the settlement, I got to stay in my apartment rent-free for the rest of the year. I saved up, got everything I needed to really set myself up, and even bought a pistol for protection. It worked out okay in the end, but it's still hard to shake that feeling I had watching the locks turn, realizing someone was coming in, and knowing there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. My cat Freya woke me up at 4 a.m. with loud meowing, and then again around 4:30 when she threw up. The house we were in at the time was open plan downstairs, with our bedroom on one end leading into the living room, dining room, and kitchen. The kitchen connected to the garage through a door that we kept open since Freya's litter box was just inside. I got out of bed, switched on the living room light, and looked around for where she'd thrown up. I went toward the kitchen to grab some cleaning supplies, but when I got about 6 feet from the open garage door, something hit me. A feeling of pure, gut-wrenching terror. It was intense, like nothing I'd ever felt before. Without even realizing it, I started backing up, ended up bumping into the stove, and then ran back to the living room, my heart racing. I had no reason to be that scared. I hadn't watched anything creepy in months, hadn't woken from a nightmare, hadn't heard or seen a thing out of place. But this fear was so strong, it felt like every nerve in my body was on high alert. I still had to clean up Freya's mess, so I braced myself, turned on every light downstairs, and sprinted back to the kitchen sink, right next to the garage door, to grab the supplies. The whole time, I felt like something was watching me. I cleaned up the mess as fast as I could, shut off the lights, and bolted back to our bedroom, feeling like a little kid afraid of the dark. But as soon as I was back in the room, that awful feeling melted away, and I felt like I'd overreacted. Freya, meanwhile, was hiding under the bed and only came out once I'd returned. She didn't leave the bedroom for the rest of the night, which wasn't normal for her. The next morning, she was meowing to go outside, way more insistently than usual. I got up, headed to the kitchen, and this time, felt totally fine near the garage. When I went to check her litter box, though, I noticed she hadn't used it at all during the night. Normally, she'd go a few times. She only went back to using it after she saw me go into the garage, and even then, she was hesitant. To this day, I have no explanation for why I felt that intense fear. But knowing that Freya sensed it too, that makes it so much worse. I live in a bit of a rural area, and one night, just after midnight, I heard banging on my front door. Naturally, I assumed it was my boyfriend trying to pull a late-night booty call. He's been known to do that. But as I got closer to the door and looked through the small glass window, I realized it wasn't him. Instead, I saw the side of some stranger's face, bearded and unfamiliar. He hadn't noticed me, so I quietly backed away from the door. Now, my house is in a cell service dead zone, so I knew my phone was useless. I grabbed the landline by my bed to call 911, but the line was dead. It felt like I'd walked into a horror movie where the killer cuts the phone line. Meanwhile, this guy was still pounding on my door, slurring, "Let me in!" I grabbed the biggest chef knife I had, honestly, it's pretty massive, and locked myself in the bathroom. I climbed onto the edge of the tub behind the shower curtain, figuring that if he managed to break down the door, I might have a chance if I could jump on him from above and go for his neck or shoulder. I was terrified, but at the same time, I was oddly pleased with my surprise attack plan. I waited, knife in hand, heart pounding. I could hear him moving around outside, running his hands along the siding and banging against the walls. Then it hit me. The sabotaged phone might not actually be cut. It just hadn't been charged in days. Maybe another handset still had some juice. I've never felt fear like I did when I made the decision to climb down, unlock the bathroom door, and leave my hiding spot to look for another phone. All while this guy was circling my house, trying every door and window. I found another handset, and miracle of miracles, it worked. I called 911, but the closest officer was about 15 minutes away. They told me to lock myself back in the bathroom and stay on the line. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. When the police finally arrived, they had this scruffy, drunk, dirty-looking kid cuffed and asked me to identify him. Turns out, there'd been a party down the road, and this guy got so wasted that he thought my house was his friend's place. He spent 20 minutes trying to get back into the party, giving me 20 minutes of pure terror. So, moral of the story, keep your phones charged, folks. You never know when you'll need them.